The leaders of the world's two most powerful countries, the US and China, are meeting. But Laura, it's far from clear whether the two men are seeing this summit the same way.
Well, President Xi will push Donald Trump on Taiwan and trying to lower trade tariffs on Chinese goods going to the United States. Donald Trump, on the other hand, will want China's help to end the war in Iran, and he'll want Chinese to buy so many US goods. And that's what we're looking out for.
So it begs, I guess, the broader question of just how well those two leaders understand each other, and what about the broader populations? As always, I'm Mariko in Singapore, and this is Asia Pacific from the BBC World Service. Twice a week, we bring you Asia Pacific stories, unpacked by those who know them best. So when we talk about China, we love to go to our correspondent in Beijing, Laura Bicker. Welcome back.
Nice to see you again.
And also in Washington, D.C., I have Zhengyu Huan, a former White House fellow during the Obama administration. He was also the head of a prominent Chinese American group called the Committee of 100. You also recently wrote a book called Rethinking China. Zhengyu, welcome to the program. You've got an impressive resume. So without taking up the entire duration of the podcast, maybe if you can briefly introduce yourself to our viewers and listeners.
Oh, thank you so much, Mariko. A real pleasure. So I was born in Shanghai, moved to the States when I was 10. My father was one of the first generation of Chinese students to study in America. Grew up in Los Angeles, went to Stanford and then Harvard Business School. I was a managing director at Intel for 7 years. And then I started several businesses in US and China.
Yeah, and at Intel, you led the negotiations with the Chinese government on IP and 4G partnerships, didn't you? So we want to get to that.
Yes.
But Laura, firstly, we spoke last month when we thought that Mr. Trump was going to go to China, and then obviously the trip got postponed because of the war in Iran. Firstly, what's the mood like in China now?
I think when it comes to the mood, when I've spoken to Chinese officials and academics, I think the mood here is quietly confident. I think there's a feeling that a deal can be done with Donald Trump. And I think also when it comes to the kind of breakthroughs, there will be deliverables, the likes of perhaps a board of trade, a board of governance on certain areas. There will be, I believe, certain kind of breakthroughs in that China will offer to buy certain things from US soybeans to beef to other agricultural products. I think where they are still divided is on the issue of tariffs. It may well be that when it comes to that agreement between President Xi and Donald Trump that they came to in Busan last October, it may well be that they just resume that. If it is successful, if they do manage to kind of get something over the line, there may be something further, but I don't think expectations are that high. I think the key thing for both the Chinese and the US side, from all the officials I've been speaking to, is that this meeting is happening at all. Because the last time a US president came here was Donald Trump himself back in 2017. And we're looking 8 years on, we're looking at a very different China, a China that is kind of feeling a bit more confident, a China that is pushing itself to the center of the geopolitical stage. And we've seen that over the last few months. We've had a parade of world leaders from the UK's Sir Keir Starmer, Canada's Mark Carney, the South Korean leader. You've had also, the Finland leader, Germany's leader. So you've had all of these leaders coming to do deals with China. And for Beijing, that's a real gift.
So Z, I hope you don't mind me calling you Z, as I saw many of your friends going with that nickname. Laura was just talking about how the Chinese are maybe hopeful that a deal could be reached, but maybe the big difference on tariffs. What do you think does President Trump want out of this summit? Not just tariffs, but obviously the war in Iran. Maybe he wants some help from the Chinese.
Yeah, I think there's probably three topics on both sides: Iran, Taiwan, and trade. But probably both sides will have different presidents. I think from the American side, probably starting with Iran, then trade, and then finally Taiwan. And then the Chinese will probably be always starting with Taiwan and then trade, and lastly Iran.
Indeed. Laura, the Iranian foreign minister was just in Beijing, wasn't he? And we spoke extensively on this podcast about what role can China play in this war in the Middle East. Has anything changed in your view? Do you think Beijing, President Xi, would like to discuss this with President Trump? Or as Z says, would it be Taiwan and then tariffs followed by the Middle East?
Now, just to kind of bring listeners and viewers up to date, China has backed Pakistan's peace proposal and, as I said, has been working behind the scenes with its long-term ally, Iran, to try to talk about how the two sides, how the US and how Iran can get to the negotiating table. Now, when it comes to this, Beijing isn't going to want to wade into this conflict. It really will want to stay on the sidelines, but there's no doubt that Beijing wants an end to this war.
Just wanting to ask about, when it comes to tariffs that the US put on China, because it was quite clear that China was the US's main target. But on that as well, the language kept changing. The percentage, at one point, it went up to 145%, but then Beijing retaliated and so on and so on. Z, do you think you've spoken quite a lot about how American lawmakers often misunderstood China? Do you think Mr. Trump and the administration underestimated China? Do you think they thought that maybe China would be easier to coerce with this kind of tariffs?
Yeah, let me give a little context. So you mentioned I was president of Committee of 100 for about 4 years. So the committee is a nonprofit started about 30 plus years ago at the urging of Henry Kissinger. He was very good friends with the noted architect I.M. Pei. And over dinner one night, Kissinger said to IM, U.S.-China relations at the time was on the up and up, and Chinese Americans, you should play a more productive role. So that nonprofit was started about 30 plus years ago for two dual purposes: Chinese American inclusion in America and a more productive U.S.-China relationship. And our position has always been, you can safeguard civil liberties in America while protecting national security. And then I got really curious because, as you know, for 40 years, the byword in the US when it comes to China was engagement. And about 10 years ago, under President Trump, that fundamentally shifted from engagement to confrontation and competition. And I'll speak a little bit about the tariffs because it just seems that all the evidence suggests that the Chinese have taken a path of co-escalation, because we have fervently believed in DC that if we just escalate just a little bit, that the other side will eventually yield. However, the other side now also fervently believe that if they escalate it along with us, that eventually we would give way. So we impose tariffs on the Chinese, they impose tariffs on us, we put their companies on the entity list, they put ours on their blacklist. We embargoed semiconductors. They embargoed rare earth. We built up our military. They built up our military. So you could see now this path of escalation. And President Trump basically has two choices: to escalate further or to de-escalate and find another set of options.
I guess that's the new confident China that Laura was speaking about earlier, that the Trump administration, the second time, is now dealing with. But you also wrote in your book, when you were working as a White House fellow, that you were surprised by many assumptions under which the US operates on China that are overblown or misleading. So aside from the current administration, can you give us some examples on how American lawmakers, in your view, gets wrong about China and its population?
Yeah, quite a few. For example, if we stay on this topic of trade, generally there's about $600 billion of trade between US and China. Now, the truth is, China's entry into WTO did destroy a lot of American manufacturing jobs. I had a chance to speak to all of the authors of the China Shock research and pretty much all of the scholars who researched job creation or destruction due to China's entry into WTO. The first part is true, but the second part that I was very surprised talking to the authors of the China Shock and all the other authors is that net equal number of jobs were created and destroyed by China's entry into the WTO for America. And quite a few scholars actually found that more jobs net were created because China's entering the WTO, primarily because of lower cost of components, as well as productivity increases. What all of them told me was that China was just a harbinger, a canary in the coal mines about the concentrated hurt of globalization and the distributed benefits of globalization. Meaning the hurt of globalization was concentrated in areas where Americans were less mobile, less educated, and the benefits were distributed, especially around the coast, where workers were more mobile, and more highly educated.
We've been talking about diplomatic tensions, but I'm wondering about how both countries' people think of each other. Are there any kind of idea or perception that you've heard in China that you thought, oh, this is quite interesting?
So there has been a survey in the last few months that shows that China's perception of the United States has kind of dropped in terms of it being this shining city on a hill, the idea that it's a kind of an ideal of democracy. And those surveys were conducted here in China. But I think it's quite interesting because I've been in Chongqing lately, and this is the new kind of influencer city. It's in southwestern China. It was once this kind of industrial, gritty hub, but after 2 decades of state investment, where obviously the local government has got into huge debt to do it, but it's now this kind of mega city with towers that rise out of the Yangtze River. And kind of it goes right through all these hillsides. It's called the cyberpunk capital of the world. Behind the scenes, if you just go one street back, you'll see workers in their 40s, 50s, and 60s still acting as porters. You see people selling vegetables. They've come from outside of Chongqing. And there are the paradox that is China is that it's both. It's got these two lines running.
Zi, you were earlier talking about America's misunderstandings or misconceptions about China. Have you come across anything that you've noticed of Chinese misconceptions about America in your view?
First of all, people-to-people exchange is so important, especially between these two countries. In fact, let us remember that the two countries actually got together again more than 50 years ago because an American missed his team bus and then hopped on the Chinese ping pong team bus, right? I mean, that really happened, and that kind of ushered in ping pong diplomacy. One sector I really want to double tap is the student population, right? At its height, there were more than 1 million Chinese students studying in America. And there were, under President Obama, there was this idea of 100,000 strong, meaning 100,000 Americans studying in China. Now, unfortunately, the numbers of Chinese students studying in the US has been dropping. One is because it's getting harder to get visa, but also because quite a few parents are concerned about mass shooting in America, about anti-Asian hate and violence in America. On the other side, really sadly, right after COVID, when there were still about 300,000 Chinese students in America, there were about 300 American students in China. Now that number has increased a little bit, but it's still infinitesimal. And I think while it's important to talk about how the general population view each other, but in the levers of government, in the levers of commerce, where it really matters, you need people who truly understand each other, who worked in and studied and speak the language of the other, because those are the key levers of exchange. And unfortunately, especially from the American side, we are not equipping Americans to be able to, work, compete, or confront.
In terms of China and America, it's no doubt that the people-to-people exchanges have been utterly decimated since the pandemic and then onwards. And then, of course, we've had a tit for tat when it comes to visas, both the US and China. There are 277,000, I reckon, Chinese students in the United States. There are only 1,000 or so US students here in China. Now we don't know what the reason is, but Nicholas Burns, who was the previous US ambassador here, had long conversations with me about this and, an interview about this. They were desperately trying here from the American side to push people-to-people exchanges. It was a key aspect of that policy by the US administration, by the Biden administration, to try to get more American students, more American scholars here on the ground. But every single time they started to set up any kind of exchange program here with students and with Americans and Chinese run by the embassy, it was blocked and it was stopped. Yeah. I think they counted
Laura,
more than 120 times.
Let me interrupt that. I'll tell you why. It's very clear. I've spoken to pretty much all the Chinese language programs in America. American students are not interested anymore. They don't see business opportunities in China. They don't see learning Chinese to be helpful for finding a job. They don't see learning Chinese being helpful for getting into the foreign services and working in DC. And students vote with their feet. If they don't see an opportunity, they don't go there. And secondarily, and this is something had nothing to do with Chinese media, unfortunately, it's our own making, that for a long time, I had American friends coming to me saying, hey, if I go to China, would I be stopped by the Chinese government? Would I be basically held ransom? I think this is because, there were a year or so or a couple of years where there were foreign people with foreign passports that were stopped in China. Now, I can't say if they were isolated or it was pervasive. You're on the ground, you know more. But that type of reporting basically meant no American actually wanted to go to China because they were afraid of, quote unquote, being stopped and kidnapped in China by the Chinese authorities.
Let me tell you what it's like here on the ground. Yes, China is welcoming lots of tourists. You can enter visa-free, but as a journalist, you're not entirely welcome. Even in Chongqing, I'm stopped and questioned by the authorities. I have been detained on numerous occasions for asking questions. We have very few journalists on the ground here. And although they keep granting visas to Chinese journalists, the same is not being reciprocated. So we have very few US journalists on the ground. And when we talk about people-to-people exchanges and understanding each other, the only way we're ever going to do that is if we allow people on the ground and if we are allowed to report and say things freely. And that cannot happen here. Even asking people about politics, they are scared to say anything because they fear being recognized or they fear saying something that is not on the party line. And I think that is something that even though China is looking more open, it's looking more transparent, it's looking like this beacon of stability in this very unpredictable world and in the face of an unpredictable president. On the ground, for those who are not coming in to take snaps of Shanghai, Beijing, or Chongqing, on the ground, things are still difficult. And that makes people-to-people exchanges, genuine people-to-people exchanges, quite difficult.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The truth is, this concept of reciprocity applies not just in journalism, but probably in trade and commerce and in many other areas where, especially from American perspective, the idea is when a Chinese company or a Chinese journalist come to America, you enjoy rights almost just the same as an American, entity. However, when an American journalist or an American company go to China, they don't get the same rights as a Chinese company, right? So I think reciprocity has been one of the defining issues that has plagued kind of relations between the two countries.
Do you think, though, it would be possible at that government-to-government level for the two superpowers to see, eye to eye? Because historically, the two countries have cooperated on a number of issues.
I've spoken to pretty much all the former ambassadors to China. And, one of them who worked with Kissinger in 1972 told me, one amazing takeaway from that time was politicians from both sides decided to basically come up with a pure fiction, a made-up story, right, called the One China policy. Completely made up, makes no sense. It's completely devoid from reality, but it's actually brought prosperity to not just between US and China, but really between China and Taiwan. For the longest time, the largest foreign direct investor in China wasn't the Americans or the Europeans. It was the Taiwanese, right? At the height, the Taiwanese had about 14% of the tax receipts in China. Even today, more than 1 million Taiwanese live and work in China. And so I do want to highlight the point that diplomacy has worked, and there is a possibility for diplomacy.
I think when it comes to those possibilities for diplomacy, I think, again, this is where the US and China are talking at different levels. So the preparation for this summit, for instance, has been really difficult because the Chinese have been absolutely exasperated by the United States. So when it comes to the preparation for summits, how it usually works is at a lower level, you've got academics, or you've got groups of people who come to agreement, and then it goes up to the next level of officials, and then they come to an agreement, then it goes up to the next level officials, and everything's fine-tuned, and you dot the I's and you stroke the T's, and then it finally goes all the way up to leader to leader. That has not happened in this occasion. Now, the Chinese appear willing to live with it. They want this meeting to happen. This idea that you don't sit down at a lower level and then work things up and get all the details ready for the two leaders. In the Trump administration, that is completely not the way it works. The president kind of likes to do it himself. Whereas in China, in South Korea, Japan, elsewhere, they like to work things up. They like to go right from the bottom, right to the top. And in this occasion, with this summit, the US has likely been distracted by the war in Iran. So you've got this case right now where you've got Chinese officials putting their heads in their hands and going, oh, right, okay, well, we just have to get on with it. So the preparation for the summit itself has not been ideal.
We can keep going forever, I think, but we shall pause this conversation here. Laura, NZ, thank you so much. NZ, I know it's the middle of the night, so thank you so much for staying up in the Asia time zone to do this podcast with us. You've been watching Asia Pacific from the BBC World Service with me, Mariko Oi, in Singapore. If you have any questions or thoughts on what we covered in this episode or any other stories from the region, please leave us a comment below. You can also get in touch with us on email. That's asiapacific@bbc.co.uk. And click like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. See you next time.